The rain fell in heavy sheets over Atlanta, blurring the city's neon lights and turning the streets into rivers of shimmering reflections. It was well past midnight, and most people were tucked away in their warm homes, safe from the storm. Officer Ethan Carter, however, was not one of them. His cruiser moved steadily down the nearly deserted streets, the wipers swiping furiously to clear his view. Ethan had been on the force for nearly a decade. He had seen enough crime, corruption, and despair to make most men jaded. But he still believed in his duty. Tonight had been uneventful, just a few disturbances, a car accident, and a false alarm. But as he turned onto Peachtree Street, a figure caught his eye. Lying on the sidewalk, drenched by the rain, was a woman. Ethan's instincts took over. He pulled over abruptly, turning on his hazard lights, and stepped out into the downpour. The woman lay motionless, her elegant black dress soaked through, clinging to her form. Her skin was a deep, warm brown, contrasting with the pallor of unconsciousness. Dark curls framed her face, her breathing shallow and unsteady. "Ma'am?" Ethan crouched beside her, checking for a pulse. It was faint but there. He touched her cheek, she was cold. He grabbed his radio. "Dispatch. This is Officer Carter. I need an ambulance at Peachtree and 10th. Female, unconscious, unresponsive but breathing." As he waited, he did a quick scan of the area. There were no signs of an attack. No blood, no weapon, just a lone woman, abandoned in the storm. But something about her was off. Her jewelry was expensive, subtle but undeniably valuable. The dress, too, was designer. This was not a random homeless person who had passed out from exhaustion. The woman stirred weakly, a soft moan escaping her lips. "Hey, stay with me," Ethan said, leaning closer. "Help is on the way." Her eyelids fluttered, and for a brief moment, she looked at him. There was something in her gaze, confusion, vulnerability, and something else, fear. Then, just as suddenly as she had woken, her eyes closed again. Ethan didn't know it then, but saving this woman would change his life forever. The emergency room was a blur of activity. Nurses and doctors rushing about, voices clipped and urgent. Ethan stood at the entrance, his uniform still damp from the rain, watching as the paramedics wheeled the woman into the trauma ward. A nurse approached him. "Are you family?" Ethan shook his head. "No, I found her unconscious on the street." The nurse nodded, scribbling something on a clipboard. "No ID, no phone. If she wakes up, we'll need someone to talk to her." Ethan hesitated. He had done his duty, found the woman, called for help. His shift was technically over. He could go home, forget about her, but something told him he wouldn't. Hours passed. He got a coffee from the hospital vending machine and took a seat in the waiting area. The storm outside had finally settled into a soft drizzle, but Ethan's thoughts were anything but calm. Who was she? How had she ended up unconscious on the street with no ID? Was she a victim of a crime? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor approached. "She's awake," he said, a little disoriented but stable. Ethan stood, adjusting his belt. "Did she say anything?" The doctor glanced at his notes. "Not much. She doesn't remember what happened before she collapsed. No name, no details, just confusion." Ethan exhaled. He had seen cases like this before: shock, trauma, sometimes drugs. He followed the doctor down the hall and into a small, sterile hospital room. The woman sat propped up on the bed, an IV in her arm, a hospital blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She turned to him as he entered, dark eyes cautious but steady. "Do you know who I am?" she asked. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I was hoping you could tell me." She swallowed, looking away. "I don't remember." Ethan had seen amnesia cases before, but something about this felt different. It wasn't the panicked confusion of someone who had lost all memory. This woman, she knew something. She just wasn't saying it. He pulled up a chair beside the hospital bed. "Okay, let's start small. Do you remember your name?" She hesitated. Then, almost too carefully, she shook her head. Ethan frowned. "Anything? Your address? Where you were before I found you?" Silence. She pressed her lips together, fingers clenching the hospital blanket. It was a subtle gesture, but Ethan had interrogated enough people to recognize the signs. She was scared. "Look," he said gently, "I'm not here to arrest you or get you in trouble. I just want to help. If someone hurt you..." "No one hurt me." The response was immediate, sharp, too sharp. Ethan leaned back, Studying her. All right, then tell me this. How does a woman in an expensive dress with no ID end up unconscious in the middle of the street? She didn't answer. Ethan exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Okay, I'll be outside if you change your mind. As he stood to leave, her voice stopped him. Wait. He turned. I think someone was following me, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. That got his attention. Who? I don't know, she said quickly. I don't remember, but before I blacked out, I felt it. Someone was there. Ethan's jaw tightened. This wasn't just a random collapse. She wasn't lost. She was running. The following morning, Ethan was back at the hospital, a coffee in hand, watching as the sun began to rise over the city. He had barely slept. Something about this woman wouldn't leave his mind. He had already put out an inquiry for missing persons reports but hadn't found any immediate matches. If she wasn't reported missing, it meant one of two things. Either no one knew she was gone, or someone wanted her disappearance to stay quiet. A nurse passed by and gave him a nod. She's asking for you. Ethan walked into the room, where she was now sitting up, her expression more composed. I remember something, she said, her voice steadier. Ethan pulled out his notepad. Go on. My name, I think it's Olivia. Ethan scribbled it down. Olivia, that's a start. Last name? A long pause. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, Hayes. Ethan's pen stopped mid-word. Hayes. There was only one prominent Olivia Hayes in Atlanta. You're the governor's wife, he said slowly, the realization hitting him like a freight train. Her eyes met his, and this time, there was no hesitation. Yes. Ethan's stomach tightened. He had thought this was a routine rescue, a simple case of an unidentified woman needing help. He was wrong. This was bigger than him, bigger than anything he had been prepared for. And if Olivia Hayes was telling the truth, then someone had tried to make the governor's wife disappear, and Ethan Carter had just stepped right into the middle of it. Ethan stared at Olivia, his grip tightening around his notepad. The name Hayes was not just any name, it was a name that carried power, influence, and danger. William Hayes had been the governor of Georgia for nearly a decade, a man both respected and feared in the political world. His administration was praised for economic growth but also whispered about in hushed tones, with rumors of backdoor dealings and hidden enemies. And now, his wife had been found unconscious in the middle of the street. Afraid to say who she was, Ethan exhaled slowly, setting his notepad down. Olivia Hayes, as in, Governor William Hayes' wife? She nodded, her fingers curling into the hospital blanket. Does your husband know you're here? Her reaction was subtle but telling. A slight twitch of her jaw, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. I don't know. Ethan didn't believe that for a second. You said you think someone was following you. He pressed. Was it someone working for the governor? I don't know, she repeated, but her voice wavered this time. Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair. Mrs. Hayes, I need you to be honest with me. If you're in danger, I can help, but I can't do that if you keep dodging my questions. Her eyes met his then, dark and intense. Do you think I don't know that? She snapped. I don't remember what happened before I collapsed. I don't know how I got there. But I know that I was running from something. The fire in her voice was unexpected, but it was also reassuring. She wasn't just some helpless politician's wife. Ethan studied her for a moment before standing. All right, I need to make a call. Her expression shifted. Who are you calling? Your husband. She grabbed his wrist before he could move. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Don't. Ethan frowned. Olivia, please. Her voice had dropped to almost a whisper. Not yet. There was raw fear in her tone now, and it made Ethan pause. Whatever had happened to her, she wasn't ready to go back. And that meant he had just stepped into something much bigger than he had anticipated. Ethan didn't call the governor. Not yet. Instead, he stepped out into the hallway and pulled out his phone, dialing his partner, Detective Marcus Reed. The line clicked, and Marcus's voice came through. Groggy, you do realize it's 6 in the damn morning, right? I need a favor, Ethan said. And coffee. Lots of coffee. There was a pause. Then, shit, what did you do? Ethan glanced back toward Olivia's room, lowering his voice. I think I just found Olivia Hayes. And she's in trouble. Marcus cursed under his breath. Where are you? Grady Memorial. She was unconscious when I found her last night. No ID. No phone. Now she's awake. and she's scared out of her mind. Marcus exhaled. Does the governor know? She doesn't want me to call him. Another long pause. You realize what that means, right? Ethan did. Olivia Hayes wasn't just some socialite with a forgettable scandal. If she didn't want her husband involved, it meant one of two things: either she didn't trust him, or she knew he had something to do with whatever had happened to her. I need you to dig around, Ethan said. Check for any police reports, domestic disturbances, anything suspicious linked to the governor or his wife in the last few days. Marcus sighed. All right, but Ethan, be careful. If you're right, you just stepped into a goddamn minefield. Ethan already knew that. As he hung up, he noticed something at the far end of the hallway. A man in a dark suit, standing near the nurse's station, watching Olivia's room. The man turned the moment Ethan's gaze locked onto him, disappearing down the corridor. Ethan's instincts flared. Someone had found her, and whoever they weren't here to check on her well-being. Ethan moved fast, striding down the hallway toward where the man had disappeared. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, the smell of antiseptic thick in the air. He turned the corner just in time to see the man push through the exit door leading to the stairwell. He was running. Ethan cursed under his breath and followed. The stairwell echoed with hurried footsteps as he descended, his own boots hitting the metal steps with practiced speed. Atlanta PD, he barked. Stop. The man didn't stop. Ethan reached the bottom just as the stranger shoved open the ground floor door and sprinted into the parking lot. The early morning air was cool and damp from the night's rain. Mist rising off the pavement. Ethan barely caught a glimpse of the man slipping into a black SUV. The engine roared to life, tires screeching as the vehicle sped out of the lot, disappearing into the city streets before Ethan could get a plate number. Shit. He stood there for a moment, heart pounding, before pulling out his phone and dialing Marcus again. Tell me you got something, he said as soon as Marcus answered. I do, Marcus replied grimly, and you're not gonna like it. Ethan pinched the bridge of his nose. Just tell me. There was a disturbance call at the governor's mansion last night. A woman screaming, but by the time officers got there, the report had been pulled. Ethan's jaw tightened. Pulled? By who? Governor Hayes' security team. Ethan looked back at the hospital entrance, where Olivia was still upstairs, waiting for answers. Jesus Christ, he muttered. He hadn't just stumbled into something dangerous. He had just picked a fight with the most powerful man in the state. Ethan returned to Olivia's hospital room, his mind racing with possibilities. He had spent years working in law enforcement. But this was different. This wasn't just about crime. This was about power. And power had a way of bending the rules. Olivia looked up as he entered, her expression guarded. What is it? He sat down, folding his arms. There was a disturbance call at the governor's mansion last night. A woman screaming. She flinched. Ethan caught the movement. That was you, wasn't it? Olivia looked away. I don't remember. That's bullshit. His voice was steady but firm. Someone covered it up. Your husband's security team pulled the report before it even made it through the system. So either the governor is looking for you and doesn't want anyone else involved. He leaned forward. Or he already knows where you are. She swallowed hard, her fingers twisting in the hospital blanket. Ethan let the silence hang between them before he spoke again. Softer this time. Olivia, if your husband did this. I don't know, she said quickly. I don't know, okay? She was lying. Or maybe she just wasn't ready to admit the truth yet. Ethan sighed. You don't have to go back to him. For the first time, her eyes softened. You don't understand. If I don't. Her voice dropped to a whisper. People will die. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. He had thought this was about a woman in trouble. But Olivia Hayes wasn't just running for her life. She was running from something far bigger than just one man. The weight of Olivia's words settled between them like a lead curtain. Ethan had spent years unraveling lies, peeling back layers of deception in murder cases, drug busts, and internal corruption within the force. But this was different. This wasn't just crime, it was politics. And in politics, the rules were written by the ones with the most to lose. He leaned forward, studying her. What do you mean people will die? Olivia exhaled, looking down at her hands. She hesitated for a long time before finally speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. There are things I know. Things I've seen. William isn't the man people think he is. His administration, his entire career, was built on deals with dangerous people. And now, he's trying to clean house. Ethan narrowed his eyes. By getting rid of you? A bitter laugh escaped her lips. By making sure I don't talk. The truth hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about domestic abuse. This wasn't about an unfaithful husband or a power struggle between a married couple. This was about silencing the one person who knew too much. Before he could press further, his phone buzzed. Marcus. Ethan answered. Talk to me. We've got a problem. Marcus's voice was sharp. 2 men showed up at Grady Memorial about 10 minutes ago, asking about a Jane Doe matching Olivia's description. No badges, no names, just concerned family. Ethan's grip tightened around his phone. Are they still there? No, but they made it clear they were coming back. Ethan turned to Olivia, who was watching him closely. We need to get you out of here. Now. She sat up straighter. Where? Somewhere they won't find you. Olivia hesitated but then nodded. All right, let's go. Ethan grabbed her hospital bag and helped her out of bed. She was still weak, her legs trembling as she tried to steady herself. Without thinking, he placed a firm hand on her back, guiding her. They didn't have much time. As they moved into the hallway, Ethan's senses were on high alert. He scanned the area, checking every face, every movement. He could feel it, the unseen eyes watching, waiting, and then he saw them. 2 men in dark suits stood at the entrance of the hospital, their gaze sweeping the corridor. Ethan didn't wait for them to notice him. He grabbed Olivia's hand and pulled her down a side hallway. Where are we going? She whispered. Back exit. Stay close. They moved quickly, slipping past nurses and patients. Ethan's pulse hammered against his ribs. His body tensed for a fight. They reached the back exit. Ethan pushed the door open, the cold morning air rushing against them. Keep walking, he murmured. They didn't stop until they reached his car. He unlocked it and ushered Olivia inside before sliding into the driver's seat. As he pulled out of the lot, he caught a glimpse of one of the men stepping out of the hospital. His phone pressed to his ear. They knew she was gone, and they would come looking. The city blurred past them in streaks of neon and steel. Olivia sat silent in the passenger seat, her hands clenched in her lap. Ethan kept his focus on the road, taking random turns to make sure they weren't being followed. Where are we going? She asked after several minutes. A safe house, Ethan said. A place outside the city where no one will think to look. She turned to him. And you just have a safe house lying around? Ethan smirked slightly. I have a friend who owes me a favor. The truth was, Ethan had prepared for situations like this. Over the years, he had encountered enough dirty cops, vengeful criminals, and desperate victims to know that sometimes, justice didn't come through the legal system. Sometimes, you had to bend the rules to protect the innocent. They drove for over an hour, leaving Atlanta behind. The towering buildings faded into rolling countryside, dark trees stretching toward the horizon. Finally, Ethan pulled off the main road onto a dirt path. The car bumped along the uneven terrain, leading them deeper into the woods. After several minutes, they reached a small cabin, tucked away beneath a canopy of oaks. Olivia frowned. This is your safe house? More like an old hunting lodge. No cell service, no security cameras, no way for anyone to track us. He killed the engine and stepped out, scanning the area before motioning for Olivia to follow. Inside, the cabin was simple but functional. A fireplace, a worn couch, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom. It wasn't much, but it was safe. Olivia wrapped her arms around herself. How long do we stay here? Until we figure out our next move. She nodded but didn't say anything. Ethan could tell she was exhausted, physically and emotionally. Get some rest, he said. I'll keep watch. She hesitated, then muttered, thank you. Ethan didn't respond. He just watched as she disappeared into the bedroom. And then he sat down, his gun on the table beside him, waiting for whatever came next. The fire crackled in the quiet cabin, casting flickering shadows along the wooden walls. Ethan sat in the living room, his body tense despite the stillness around him. His mind raced, replaying the last 24 hours. Olivia Hayes, the governor's wife. She was right in front of him. A woman who held secrets that could shake the entire state government. And she was afraid, terrified, of the man who was supposed to protect her. Ethan ran a hand through his hair. He needed a plan. A creak in the floorboards made him turn. Olivia stood in the doorway of the bedroom, wrapped in a blanket. Her dark curls framed her face. And for the first time, Ethan saw how vulnerable she looked. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Too many thoughts." He gestured to the couch. "Sit." She hesitated but then walked over, settling beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, quietly, she said, "I wasn't always afraid of him." Ethan turned to her. "William?" She nodded. "When we first met, he was different, charming, ambitious. I believed in him. I loved him." Ethan remained silent, letting her talk. "But power changes people," she continued. "Or maybe it just reveals who they really are." She looked down at her hands. "I stayed because I thought I could handle it. That I could be strong enough to fix what was broken." Ethan exhaled. "But now you're running." Her eyes met his. And for the first time, he saw something beyond fear. "Yes." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "There's something I need to show you." Ethan frowned. "Show me what?" She reached into the folds of her blanket, pulling out a small flash drive. Ethan's heart pounded. "What's on it?" he asked. She swallowed. "Proof." And with that single word, Ethan knew there was no turning back. Ethan took the flash drive from Olivia's trembling hands, his mind already racing with possibilities. "What kind of proof?" he asked. Olivia hesitated, then said, "Evidence of corruption, blackmail, illegal deals. I spent years collecting it, but I never had the courage to use it." Ethan plugged the drive into his laptop. As the files loaded, his stomach clenched. Documents, wire transfers, names of powerful men, and at the center of it all, Governor William Hayes. Ethan looked up at Olivia. "This isn't just dangerous." She met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "I know." The question now was simple. What the hell were they going to do with it? Ethan stared at the laptop screen, his fingers hovering over the trackpad as file after file loaded. The evidence Olivia had gathered wasn't just damning, it was explosive. Wire transfers linked to offshore accounts, secret memos between high-profile politicians, emails that hinted at bribery, election tampering, and even violent coercion. And at the center of it all, William Hayes. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Jesus Christ." Olivia sat beside him, her arms wrapped around herself. "I told you," she whispered. "I wasn't just running from my husband. I was running from this." Ethan leaned back, shaking his head. "How long have you had this?" "A little over a year," she admitted. "I started putting things together after I noticed discrepancies in William's campaign funding. At first, I thought he was just playing dirty politics. But then I dug deeper." Ethan frowned. "And why didn't you go to the authorities?" She let out a bitter laugh. "Who do you think runs the authorities?" She was right. If the governor was involved in corruption at this level, there was no telling how deep his influence ran. The moment she had taken this information to the wrong person, she would have been silenced. Ethan glanced back at the files. "You have proof of money laundering, election fraud, hell, even a few suspicious accidents that don't look so accidental." He turned to her. "Why now? What change?" Her fingers dug into the fabric of her sleeves. "I think he found out I had it." Ethan's jaw tightened. "He always had people watching me," she continued, her voice quieter now. "But the last few weeks, it was different. I started noticing things. My laptop would be in a different spot. My phone would be acting strange. Calls dropping. Then last night," she trailed off, shaking her head. "Someone came for you." Ethan finished for her. She nodded. "And if you hadn't found me, I don't think I would have woken up." A heavy silence fell between them. Ethan closed the laptop and stood. "We need to move." Olivia looked up. "Where?" "Somewhere safer. If your husband has people watching hospitals, he'll have people watching safe houses too." He grabbed his gun and holster. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew one thing for sure. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting back. Ethan and Olivia left the cabin just before dawn. The air was crisp, the woods eerily quiet. He had packed light, a few essentials, his weapon, and Olivia's flash drive secured in the inner pocket of his jacket. They drove in silence, taking back roads, avoiding highways. Olivia kept her gaze fixed outside the window, lost in thought. After an hour, she finally spoke. "Where are we going?" Ethan tapped the steering wheel. "I know a guy." She gave him a skeptical look. "You have a lot of guys." Ethan smirked slightly. "That's the job." The guy in question was James Holloway, an ex-journalist turned whistleblower. He had spent the last decade digging into government scandals, exposing corruption, and narrowly escaping more than a few assassination attempts. If anyone could help them leak this information to the right people, it was him. They pulled into Atlanta just as the city was waking up. Skyscrapers loomed overhead, and the streets buzzed with the rhythm of a new day. Ethan parked in a discreet lot and led Olivia through a series of alleyways until they reached an old bookstore. The sign read Holloway's Rare Finds, but it was far more than that. Inside, books lined the walls, the scent of old paper thick in the air. Behind the counter, a man in his late 50s sat sipping black coffee, his silver-streaked hair disheveled. James Holloway looked up and immediately frowned. "Jesus, Carter, what did you drag in this time?" Ethan smirked. "A story." James glanced at Olivia, recognition flickering in his sharp eyes. He let out a low whistle. "Olivia Hayes. Now this is interesting." Olivia stiffened. "You know who I am?" James chuckled. "Sweetheart, the entire country knows who you are. But most of them don't know the version of you that's standing here in my shop, looking like she just crawled out of a grave." Olivia's jaw tightened. Ethan pulled out the flash drive and set it on the counter. "We need your help." James eyed the drive before exhaling. "I assume this is something that can get me killed?" Ethan nodded. "And about a dozen other people." James picked up the drive, rolling it between his fingers. Then, without another word, he inserted it into his computer. The moment the files popped up, his expression changed. His usually cynical eyes widened as he scrolled through pages of damning evidence. "Oh, shit." James leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen like it was a bomb waiting to explode. "This is bigger than anything I've ever seen," he murmured. "Do you have any idea what this could do?" Olivia crossed her arms. "Yes, that's why we're here." James ran a hand down his face. "You're asking me to leak this? To take down the most powerful man in the state?" Ethan gave him a pointed look. "That's what you do, isn't it?" James scoffed. "Yeah, when it's some mid-level senator embezzling funds. This?" He gestured at the screen. "This is an execution list." Ethan exchanged a glance with Olivia. "Can you do it?" James sighed. "I can, but I need time." Ethan checked his watch. "We don't have time." James studied them for a moment before nodding. "All right, give me a few hours. But if this goes public, you both better be ready to run. Because the second this drops, every cop, politician, and contract killer on Hayes' payroll will be gunning for you." Ethan already knew that. Olivia did too. They had started a fire, and there was no putting it out now. They didn't stay in one place for long. After leaving James to his work, Ethan took Olivia to another safe location, a motel off the beaten path. One of the few places that didn't ask questions. They kept the lights off, curtains drawn. Ethan sat near the window, gun resting on the table beside him. Olivia sat on the edge of the bed, arms wrapped around her knees. Hours passed. Then Ethan's phone vibrated. A single text from James. "It's out." Ethan's pulse quickened. He grabbed the remote and turned on the news. And there it was. The headline scrolled across the screen in bold, blaring letters. "Breaking news. Leaked documents reveal Governor Hayes' corruption scandal." The anchor's voice was urgent. "We have just received thousands of classified documents linking Governor William Hayes to illegal political dealings, bribery, and possible election fraud." The leak, which appeared online just an hour ago, has already sent shockwaves through the political sphere. The governor's office has yet to respond. Olivia let out a slow, shaky breath. "It's happening." Ethan watched her, his jaw tight. "It's only just beginning." His phone buzzed again. Another text. "They know it was you." Ethan stood, already reaching for his gun. Outside, a car pulled into the motel parking lot. Then another. Then a third. Olivia turned to him, eyes wide. They had found them, and this time, they weren't coming to talk. Ethan's fingers curled around the grip of his gun as he moved swiftly to the window. Peering through the slats of the blinds, 3 black SUVs idled outside, their headlights casting long beams through the dark motel parking lot. The men stepping out of them weren't cops. They weren't reporters. They were something worse, hired enforcers. The kind that didn't leave loose ends. He turned to Olivia, who stood frozen in the center of the dimly lit motel room. The television still flickered with news coverage of the leak, the voices of reporters filling the tense silence. "They found us," she whispered. Ethan grabbed her wrist, his voice low and firm. "We need to move, now." She nodded, her fear barely contained. He grabbed the duffel bag he had packed earlier, slinging it over his shoulder while keeping his gun steady in his free hand. They didn't have time for a plan. They barely had time to breathe. A heavy knock pounded against the motel room door. "Olivia," a voice called from outside. A voice Ethan recognized. He exchanged a glance with Olivia before turning back to the door. It was James Holloway. "Open the damn door, Carter." Ethan hesitated, his instincts screaming at him not to trust anyone. But if James was compromised, they were already dead anyway. Slowly, he unlocked the door and pulled it open just enough to see James's face. His usual smug expression was gone, replaced by something close to fear. "You've got about 10 seconds before those guys out there storm in," James muttered. "Get in my car." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Olivia's hand and yanked her forward, pushing past James as they sprinted toward the side alley where James's old sedan was parked. Behind them, the motel door burst open. Gunfire erupted, shattering the motel's cheap windows as bullets ripped through the walls. Ethan shoved Olivia into the backseat and dove in after her. James slammed the gas pedal to the floor. Tires screeched against the asphalt, and the car lurched forward, swerving wildly as bullets chased them down the street. "Jesus Christ," James hissed, gripping the wheel. "You couldn't have picked a quieter way to take down the governor?" Ethan was too busy checking their six to respond. The black SUVs were already turning onto the road behind them, their engines roaring. "They're not letting us go," Olivia said, her voice tight with fear. Ethan clicked the safety off his gun. "They're not supposed to." They weren't just trying to silence Olivia anymore. They were trying to erase her. James weaved through the city streets at breakneck speed, tires screeching as he took sharp corners, trying to shake the SUVs trailing behind them. Ethan leaned out the window, gun in hand, and fired off 3 precise shots. One bullet cracked the windshield of the lead SUV, forcing it to swerve violently. But the others kept coming. "Where the hell are we going?" Ethan shouted over the roar of the engine. James yanked the wheel hard to the right, taking them onto an industrial road lined with abandoned warehouses. "I have a place. Just hold them off for another minute." Ethan gritted his teeth, reloading as another round of gunfire exploded behind them. Olivia ducked low in the backseat, her hands gripping the seat in front of her. Another SUV lurched forward, ramming into their rear bumper. The impact sent them skidding. Ethan barely had time to brace before James slammed on the brakes. The sudden stop forced their pursuers to react too late. One SUV veered off course, crashing through a chain-link fence, while the others skidded wildly. James didn't waste time. He slammed on the gas again, cutting through a narrow alleyway before finally pulling into a large, abandoned shipping warehouse. The second they stopped, Ethan was out of the car, gun raised. James and Olivia followed, sprinting toward the shelter of rusted metal crates. The SUVs pulled up moments later. Men in dark suits spilled out, heavily armed, their faces expressionless. Ethan's jaw clenched. They weren't just enforcers, these were killers. Then, from the back of one SUV, a man stepped out. A man Ethan had seen before, on television, in newspapers, standing beside the governor. It was Darren Cole, William Hayes' most trusted advisor. "You should have stayed hidden, Olivia," Cole called out. His voice was calm, but there was ice beneath it. "You don't know what you've done." Olivia stepped forward, her shoulders squaring. "Oh, I know exactly what I've done," she said. "I exposed him." Cole sighed, shaking his head. "And for that, you had to die." Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger. "Come and try." And then, all hell broke loose. The warehouse erupted in gunfire. Ethan ducked behind a steel container, returning fire with sharp, precise shots. Bullets ricocheted off metal beams, the air thick with smoke and dust. James was next to him, reloading. "I really hate your taste in friends, Carter." Ethan smirked grimly. "Same." Olivia stayed low, clutching a discarded metal rod like it was a lifeline. Cole's men moved in a tight formation, their training evident. They weren't just here to kill, they were here to eliminate any possibility of Olivia escaping. Ethan knew they couldn't hold them off forever. "James," he called, "get Olivia out of here." James shot him a glare. "And leave you here to get shot? I'll cover you. Just go." James cursed under his breath but nodded. He grabbed Olivia's arm. "Come on." She hesitated. "Ethan, go." "Olivia," Ethan barked. I'll meet you. She looked at him one last time before running. Ethan turned back to the fight. His adrenaline pumping, he fired, taking out 2 of Cole's men before ducking behind a crate. Cole himself wasn't shooting. He was watching, calculating. You're a good cop, Carter. Cole called out. You don't have to die for her. Ethan smirked. You're right, you do. He fired. Cole ducked, but not fast enough. Ethan's bullet grazed his shoulder. The man stumbled back, cursing. His men faltered for just a second. And that was all Ethan needed. He ran, cutting through the warehouse as James and Olivia disappeared into the night. By morning, the entire country was watching. The leaked documents had already caused chaos in political circles. But now, with Cole's men dead and multiple witnesses placing Olivia at the center of it all, there was no hiding anymore. The governor tried. He held a press conference, standing beside his wounded advisor, spinning lies about fabricated evidence and a conspiracy to take him down. But then Olivia appeared, live, on national television, with Ethan standing beside her. She laid out everything, the documents, the threats, the assassination attempts, and when she was done, she said the words that sealed the governor's fate. I was married to a monster. And now, the world knows the truth. William Hayes was arrested within the hour. The empire he had built collapsed overnight. Ethan watched from the sidelines, his hand resting lightly on Olivia's back. The war was over. And somehow, against all odds, they had won. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. What now? Ethan exhaled, looking out at the flashing lights of reporters and the chaos unfolding before them. Well, he said, smirking slightly, I don't think we'll ever be bored again. For the first time in what felt like forever. Olivia laughed. And just like that, they walked away, together.